thank you again, and thank you, Carlos, for those very important comments. You know how we feel about immigration as well. We totally believe in fair, just treatment of immigrants. And now I'm going to move on to the panel with Brian. For me, it is a real honor to sit on a panel with Brian Porter. As many of you know, Brian Porter is the president and CEO of Scotiabank, and he has been in that role since 2013, November of 2013. He was appointed president in November of 2012. He brings enormous depth and breadth to the experience of, or to his job as CEO. But Brian is also a thinker, and he believes deeply in North America and understands all of the implications. So for us this morning to have the privilege to listen to him about and hear his views about Mexico, Scotiabank, and the Canadian-Mexican relationship is, I think, a unique opportunity and privilege. So why don't we just jump in. Brian, could you tell us a little bit about Scotiabank? Has a major presence in Mexico. Mexico is very important to Scotiabank. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Susan, and thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be back in Mexico. Our operations in Mexico are very important to the overall bank. Just to set the context of Scotiabank globally, Scotia would be one of the top 20 banks in the world in terms of any measure, profitability, market cap, what have you. We have close to 90,000 employees. We're headquartered in Toronto. Of the 90,000 employees, over 50,000 of those reside outside Canada. Our major markets are Mexico, Peru, Chile, Colombia, countries in Central America and the Caribbean. Mexico is very important for us. We're a full-service bank here. We've been here for close to 50 years and increased our scale dramatically with the purchase of Inverlat from the government of Mexico in the 90s. We have 3.2 million customers, a branch network of over 800 branches. We'd be the 6th largest bank in Mexico today by any measure, profitability, assets, etc. In terms of market share. The market share is somewhat skewed. We'd be a bigger mortgage bank, an auto finance bank, because that's been a traditional asset class for us. But we're very proud of our operations here in Mexico, led by Enrique Zorrilla, who's here this morning. And Enrique reports to the head of our international bank, Nacho Deschamps.
Committed so much of our talent to Mexico. What's your long-term thesis about growth in Mexico and the opportunity in the country? And if you could also comment a little bit on the digital lab that was just opened here.
Sure. Well, in terms of capital deployment and as senior management in the institution, at the end of the day, we're measured by how we deploy the shareholders' equity. And Mexico is right up there in terms of how we want to deploy capital. The best investments we can make in our organization it's in its people. So we're constantly training and have new programs for our people here. Technology is a big thrust for this bank globally. We opened a digital factory here in Mexico City, and we have similar factories in Bogota, Colombia, Lima, Peru, Santiago, Chile, and in downtown Toronto. And so what are we working on in terms of the advent of technology? And it's all around the customer. Customers' preferences are changing. We all know that. But today, for example, 80% of day-to-day transactions for us would be done either through our internet application on our mobile device. So we're working, crews here in Mexico City are working on how do we reduce friction points for customers, how do we make it easier for customers to do business with us, those type of things. But in terms of country specific and in terms of our long-term view of Mexico, is we view it as a very, very good place to invest. And I break it down into 3 buckets, Susan. One is demographics, the other is skills, and the third would be trade. So when you look at demographics, 129 million people, average age is 27 versus 41, 42 in Canada or the US. Um, uh, Highly educated, 50% of Mexican households would define themselves as middle class today. So the demographics are important. We like to say at the bank, we like to get the big picture right. So from a demographics perspective, Mexico has everything going for it. In terms of skills, and I think this is highly important, is that if you look at what's happening in Mexico's education system today, it's really astonishing. Mexico, for instance, graduated 112,000 engineers from its universities last year. The United States graduated 120,000. And that's important. A math-based educational system is really important. Mexico would have produced more engineers than the Republic of Germany last year, more engineers than Brazil, which is 200 million people. Mexico produced close to 14,000 computer science grads last year. So that's important. As a financial services company, we like to call ourselves, we're a technology business that happens to be in the financial services business. So if you go down to the digital factory we talked about, you'll see user design specialists, data scientists, data engineers, computer science scientists working on a variety of these problems we outlined before. And the third point about the overall or the overarching attractiveness of Mexico is trade. The Mexican economy is deeply interconnected with Canada and the United States. And Mexico also has 47 similar trade agreements with other nations around the globe. So we view Mexico as highly, highly attractive. We're growing our operations here. We view it as a good place to invest in people, invest in technology, and build our business.
Thank you very much. So moving on a little bit, I mean, you've kind of led the way into a discussion of NAFTA. In your view, what has NAFTA really meant for North American competitiveness? Because I think this is at the heart of everything.
Well, look, I think that it's been absolutely critical. Keying in on your remarks this morning is that having open economies and interconnectedness have been very beneficial for all three countries. It's been beneficial for consumers, it's been beneficial for workers, and unfortunately the whole dialogue on this has been turned somewhat upside down, and it has more to do with the adoption of technology than anything else. And so NAFTA has been critically important to all countries. Workers are better off, it's created jobs, standards of living have increased in all three countries. And I say this, I don't mean this as a plug because we've got lots of endorsements, but our economics department, and I'd encourage you if you're interested to go online and look at some pieces written by Brett House and JF Perot about NAFTA and the importance of NAFTA to all three countries. And it's, I don't say it as a plug, we've got lots of accolades from...
This is off script a little bit, but why do you think, I mean, Canada's been very good in trying to describe why trade is socially inclusive. Why do you think that the United States generally and many countries miss that? Why aren't we able to explain how this is helping raise standard of livings for all peoples?
Well, I think that, and I say this very, very important, to the successful operations of the Canadian economy.
So we're going to start, it's absolutely clear that there is going to be a modernization of NAFTA. From your perspective, what do you think is the most important thing that needs to come out from that modernization?
Well, look, I think that the agreement's 22 or 23 years old, and I don't think there's any debate that modernization around the NAFTA agreement is important. I think that people are leaning towards three things. One is IP, given how the economies have changed and developed over the last 20 years. I think that services are critically important. And e-commerce, for example, and that's just a reflection of the economy we're in today. I wouldn't view any of those as threatening. I think that the Canadian economy is 70% services. That's what we do. It's increasing and it's critically important to the economy. So, look, I think the modernization of NAFTA is critically important. And, we can sit up here and recite all sorts of different statistics, but You know, if we're a global bank, we've got operations all over the globe, is that, you know, if there's a Fortune 500 company or a big European multinational that wants to establish operations, they're looking to North America. And they're looking to North America because of all the cost advantages: skilled labor force, cheaper energy, less regulation than you'd have in Europe or other jurisdictions. So, you know, NAFTA has been a powerhouse. And when you look at it, it accounts for 30% of the world's GDP, and we have 6.5% of the population.
So we know there's going to be a renegotiation, a modernization. How is the Canadian private sector working among themselves, and how will you work with the Canadian government moving forward?
Well, Minister Freeland, who's here today and will be speaking later today, has been very accessible on this point. And we've been working with, you know, we believe at the bank that, you know, a part of our role is the financial ties, the trade ties, and that go along with being a bank. And we've been very active with the government here in Mexico and with the government of Canada and the U.S. explaining the key issues we think that are really important at this stage in the negotiation. So for Canada, you know, it's Canadian business is uniformly in favor of a renegotiation or a modernization of Canada. There's been some friction points by industry, whether it's softwood lumber or the dairy supply chain or things like that. But those are minor irritants in the whole scope of things, and these agreements are put together with mechanisms to deal with those irritants. So away from that, Canada looks forward to the negotiation. The minister's kept her cards pretty close to her vest, which I think is sensible given the time frames. But we look forward to a modernization of NAFTA. And I will say, you know, this is important for a lot of Canadian businesses because Canadians have been investing heavily in Mexico, and they have been investors in the U.S. for a long period of time. But, you know, whether it's Canadian pipeline companies, energy companies, mining companies, the things that Canada does well, auto companies have a significant role here in the Mexican economy. So Canada looks forward to a modernization agreement on NAFTA.
And what do you think of timing? I mean, what do you think is realistic in all of this from your perspective?
You know, I don't know. I think that, you know, there's a Mexican election next fall, so that's going to play into the timing on this. And every government's going to have their own perspective and view on timing. But, you know, it's going to take time, and I think everybody has to be, you know, cognizant of these things don't happen overnight, and it's going to take some time, Susan.
I'm sure it's going to take time, and I agree that timing is going to be one of the most critical issues as we march towards, frankly, an election in this country and congressional elections in the United States as well. We'll have midterm elections in the U.S. So one more question on NAFTA. As we look, a lot of people like to talk about how NAFTA hasn't been successful, and you and I both believe that NAFTA has been deeply successful. How should we promote that? How should we talk about it in the right way, in the right terms, and make sure everybody, you know, how do we get this to kind of dribble down to people?
Well, I think forums like this are critically important, and I know that they're happening across our country and Canada, and people are speaking out about it. You know, 75% of Canada's trade is with the U.S. This is critically important for us to have a successful trade pact with the United States. But I think forums like this are really important, having sensible dialogues with the facts and taking the emotion out of the discussion. You know, in election campaigns, emotion gets interjected and the facts sometimes get distorted. And the reality is that, as I said earlier, this isn't about trade has created jobs. It's about the adoption of technology in all businesses. And as a bank that banks all different industries, whether I'm visiting an airline company or a meat packing business or a mining company, all these businesses are becoming digital. And all these businesses are investing heavily in technology. And, you know, if you look at costs of production in any business, labor costs are just one component. You know, it's the cost of technology is generally bringing the cost of production down, and I think that's why I think it's really important to stick to the facts, stay very grounded, and I think that'll serve all three countries very well in this negotiation.
I think you make a really wonderful point, because the fact of the matter is technology is here to stay, and the threat to the factory worker is a robot. It's not a trade agreement or anything of the sort. So we need to explain technology and train North American workers for a 21st and 22nd century economy.
And I think another component of this, and we're starting different programs through the bank, it's about, you know, we're cognizant that workers are getting displaced. And, you know, companies have to have retraining programs. You know, we're shrinking our branch network globally, thoughtfully, because the utility of the branch is changing and customers' preferences are changing. Tellers are important. So if you're a really good teller and you want to go do something else in the bank, we'll help you get there. We offer different programs to help you reinvent yourself, come back with a different skill set. Labor mobility is going to be absolutely critical in this whole discussion too. So there's a lot of different points here, and but you know, when you talk about technology, we haven't talked about AI today and artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact a lot of businesses. We're thinking about it in our business. You know, that's going to replace a lot of sort of processes in the bank that need to be updated and changed, and that's going to take some jobs out. That's a reality. But you know, we are creating other jobs that we think are more meaningful in other parts of the bank. So it's all about balance.
We haven't talked about cybersecurity either, and that's a whole space where whatever happens in the negotiations on NAFTA, cybersecurity will also have to be a point that's touched on.
And cybersecurity is, you know, I went to Israel with a number of my colleagues in early January, and we've got investments and working partnerships with some Israeli companies all around fraud detection, cybersecurity, because, you know, it's paramount for us to protect the perimeter of the bank, protect our customers' information, and protect our own information. So these are growing issues. They're going to be cybersecurity, or, you know, we're in touch with the Canadian governments and governments wherever we operate. But, you know, we all know what happened last week in the UK. But, and I don't want to sound dour about this, but someday we'll walk in and the power grid will be down, and you have to have a contingency plan. And that's a reality. The hackers are getting increasingly more sophisticated and more bold, and it's not going to go away.
So let's move on to Mexican-Canadian relations and talk a little bit about that before we open it up to the floor. And you have a bird's-eye view. I think the private sector is somewhat smaller in Canada than the United States, and so when Mexican officials come to Canada, you're right on the front line, hosting them, going to Ottawa to participate in government-private sector discussions. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States from a private sector perspective?
Well, I think the bilateral relationship between Mexico and Canada has been extremely strong and continues to be very strong because we've got something in common. We've got a big brother next door that we both have to deal with, and so that we have a common interest, if you will. But it's, you know, I think that, you know, Canada has a high regard for what's gone on here in Mexico economically and socially in the last 20 years. If you look at the privatizations, the policy reforms that have happened, the liberalization to allow foreign direct investment in this country, which has increased 6.5 times over the last 20-some years. So, you know, and as I mentioned, Susan, Canadian companies are big investors in Mexico. And, you know, energy reform is there's a lot of Canadian companies playing a big role in Mexicans' energy reform. And they view it because it's attractive, it's on the same continent. There's going to be a North American energy strategy, plan, complex, call it what you will. So the relationship between our two countries is excellent and continues to grow nicely.
So one of the things that's always impressed me about you is that you are a long-term, medium-term strategic thinker. And you really sit and you look at issues and you say, well, this is the way it has to be in the long term, and this is the way we get there. So as you look at what's going to happen over the next several months, define how you see the medium term, the long term, both in terms of relationship, but also in terms of what's your long-term vision for NAFTA, for North America?
Well, it's a good question, and one we spend a lot of time thinking about at the bank, and we're going to spend our board session in June talking about it, is, where do we see the bank in 5 to 10 years, and what different levers do we have to push, what investments do we have to make. We're very comfortable with our geographic footprint, and for all the obvious reasons. And, we're as defined as much as where we are not as where we are. Not all developing countries are created equally. The tone at the top matters, the policy reforms, what's been done economically and socially, and all the different examples I've given you here today. So we find Mexico very, very attractive for foreign investment. But, we're 185 years old. We're older than the country of Canada itself. You don't get to be 185 years old without thinking long term. So, we're looking at investments, potential acquisitions, things that turn the dial for our shareholders, for our customers, for our employees, for our stakeholders 5 or 10 years out. We think we've chosen our countries very well, and because of all the reasons I've outlined. And so we think the future is very bright for Mexico, for the Pacific Alliance trading bloc, and that's generally how we think about things.
Dream and think about what North America looked like 10 years from now. What would it look like?
Look, I think, as I mentioned earlier, North America has everything going for it. Whether it's skilled labor force, cheap energy, regulation. We all like to complain about regulation, but all I can tell you is try some other countries and in the developed world, and you'll come running home pretty quickly. But so I think we're gonna get a modernized NAFTA agreement done, and I won't guess on the timeline. I won't take odds on that. But I think North America is going to continue on the same drumbeat, and I think that standard of living for all three countries will be significantly higher in 10 years. There'll be more jobs created because the dynamics are here. Everything's set for us. The table is set for us. So I'm very bullish about North America, and I think NAFTA has been very good to us, and we've only seen the start of it.
We have microphones. If you could raise your hand, identify yourself. And if you don't want to listen to me anymore, you really should raise your hand and identify yourself. So who has the first question? Does anybody have a question? Yes, we have a question right over here. Please. We need a microphone. Our organization seems to be letting us down here. Well, you can stand up and ask a question anyway. Can you comment on the rule of law, particularly on the Canadian, particularly the mining companies investing here in Mexico?
It has been a friction point, there's no question about it, and I was thinking about it when I was walking this building today. I was here 3 years ago for the Three Amigos Summit with Obama, Harper, Prime Minister Harper, and President Peña Nieto, and that question was asked of the Mexican president by a number of Canadian mining company executives who have significant interest here. So, I think that the rule of law is You know, and there's been judicial reforms here in Mexico, and I think Secretary Meade spoke about it at our dinner last night. Mexico's got to continue along this path. There's, you know, this is a definite area for improvement. You know, I got a call from a Canadian company CEO last week that's building a pipeline here, and significant, you know, who actually owns the property, rule of law type issues. So this is an issue that is going to need clarity if Mexico wants and hopes to get more foreign direct investment in some particular industries.
Thank you. If I can make a follow-up, does that in the outlook for the upcoming presidential elections in Mexico, does that in any way pose a challenge for that? Is that a concern that you're seeing among your clients in the space?
Everybody's very cognizant and aware of it. You know, I can speak from the Scotiabank perspective. As I said, you know, we're 185 years old. We've worked with governments in the Caribbean from the far left. We've dealt with governments from the far right in different jurisdictions. That's part of being a bank. And, you know, we take the view of if we're in a country, we're there for a long, long period of time. And we've been able to adapt. When we're in these countries, we run local banks. We're very involved in the community. But look, if governments change, and you know it's somewhat hypothetical, but if you have a change of government here, do they have control over Congress or the upper house, or what impact can they actually have on legislation? So those are all things we think about in terms of the larger picture about making investments. But I would be, you know, election cycles are critical to the well-functioning of an economy, and it's something we give a lot of thought to.
Additional questions? No one? So I get to ask you a question. You sure? Okay, so I'll ask you another question. Nobody? Okay. So in your view, we're gonna march forward. What do you see as the biggest challenge that Mexico has in front of it today?
That's a very good question, and I'd go back to the question that was asked earlier. I think it's the rule of law. I really do. This has been a thorn in the side for the country, is that, you know, again, the Secretary talked about this, is that, you know, why aren't certain governors of certain states put in jail? And that's not the right answer. You've got to depoliticize the process. You need a judiciary that's independent, that can fulfill its responsibilities. So I think rule of law, and I know there's been some judiciary reforms. The country's made some headway, but candidly, it's got to make more.
Yes, Oscar. Right here.
Thank you. So, the head of a Canadian bank that invested in Mexico, what do you think you can do to help through this situation, or we can do here in this room to support, to help, to, I don't know, to push for a good outcome of this negotiation?
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. You know, I think continue to do what you're doing. I'm sure you're talking to your congressman. I'm sure you're talking to the senators in your home state, and trips to Washington. You know, we're making trips to Washington. I know our minister's making trips to Washington. Other government officials in Canada are, and just lay out the facts and tell the story in a thoughtful, concise, grounded way. And I think, you know, as much as that sounds homespun and a bit of motherhood, I think it's critically important.
Additional questions? God, people are really, back there, perfect.
Thank you. I'm Jose Maria Gutierrez from Volkswagen Mexico. I would like to ask you, how do you see the capital mobility between our countries or between Europe due to the different changes that the Federal Reserve is making in the interest rates in the United States? We have had an overpowered dollar by the beginning of this year. Some of Mr. Trump's declarations, I think, brought it a little bit down, but there are such high expectations under what is the Fed is going to do with its interest rate regarding inflation in the United States and also these interests. How do you see the capital mobility between the countries? How do you see the evolution of the exchange rate between them?
I didn't get all that. Can you?
How do you see the capital mobility between the North American countries in respect to the Federal Reserve of the United States interest rate decisions?
How do you see capital flows due to the Federal Reserve interest rate decisions? Okay.
Okay, well, you know, I prefaced some of my remarks earlier by saying that, you know, the macroeconomic policy reform, the liberalization of free trade in Mexico has been, since the mid-90s, has been critically important to its success. So I think that the stock of FDI in this country has increased 6.5 times since then. And, you know, I know a lot of companies in my travels, including our own, that are looking to continue to invest in Mexico. If you're looking at it more from a trading perspective in terms of, you know, interest rates are going to increase in the U.S., that's been well targeted by the Federal Reserve. They've said that. The U.S. economy is performing very well. But the Mexican economy is performing very well. The first quarter GDP was revised up to 2.8%. I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. And that's candidly a function of the reforms and the internal generation in this Mexican economy that's driving that. So, you know, I can speak to our first quarter results, which have already been published. You know, our day-to-day business in Mexico is performing very well, and we see a good pipeline of business. In terms of capital mobility, you know, I think that from a trading perspective, you know, markets kind of overdid it late last year. They were overreacting to the potential of a possibility of no trade agreement. Obviously, the Mexican peso, which is a bellwether for emerging market currencies, got hit very hard. Bond spreads moved out. Having said that, cagey, thoughtful investors made some pretty good investments then. So I don't, I'm not overly concerned about, you know, capital flows out of emerging markets given rising rates in the U.S. I think this has been very tempered, been very thoughtful in terms of discourse to markets by the Fed in terms of what their intentions are. So I don't think anybody should be surprised.
How you doing? My name's Tom Baldwin. I work at a local private equity fund here in Mexico City called Live Capital. I have a two-part question. The first is, what is Scotiabank's strategy as it pertains to cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera? And the second part of the question is, what do you think the role for cryptocurrencies could be in terms of catalyzing economic development in developing economies like Mexico?
Yeah.
Up here so Nelson can get the next question.
Sure.
Thank you.
The question pertained to cryptocurrencies and what our view is. You know, I'm probably going to sound a little old-fashioned in this, but, you know, I believe currencies have to have a store of value, and markets understand that, and people understand that. So I think the important thing about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is blockchain technology and the technology behind that. We're spending a lot of time on those. You know, we're part of the R3 consortium, and we're doing a lot of work internally because blockchain technology allows us to free up a lot of our balance sheet, less collateral, we just become a more efficient bank from a balance sheet perspective. But I think cryptocurrencies have a long way to go. I think there's some development that's needed. Security is going to be critically important, going back to the comment I made earlier about cybersecurity. But I think at the end of the day, markets want a store of value and understand a store of value in a currency.
Good. Thank you very much. Nelson Cunningham with McClarty Associates in Washington. From our perch in Washington, we follow these events extremely closely, as you would imagine. There's a second policy idea in Washington that is moving along, which is entirely separate from renegotiation of NAFTA, but that could have a powerful implication on North American relations, and that's tax reform. And in particular, the House Republicans' idea, Paul Ryan's idea, of a border adjustment tax that would be applied to goods coming from, say, Mexico or, say, Canada into the United States. Have you analyzed, from the bank's perspective, how that would affect commercial relations across the border, entirely separate from the NAFTA matter?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a timely question. And I personally have not done a lot of work on it. Others in the bank have. I'd be concerned about it for a variety of reasons. A lot of concerns for our energy industry, a lot of concerns, we're the largest exporter of energy to the U.S. There's a lot of industries that could have a severe impact with a border tax. I'd prefer not to see one for obvious reasons. I think obviously NAFTA is the way to go. And, if you were to look at a border tax in Mexico 3 months ago, the currency already adjusted 20%. So if you're thinking about a border tax, currencies do the work. Freestanding currencies do their work. Markets may be inefficient for a period of time, but they generally get it right over a period of time. But I'd be wary of a border adjustment tax. That's my gut feel, early stage.
One last question. Tell me we have time for. So right here.
Hi, my name is Jorge Lopez from Vitalis, a pension fund management in Mexico. And my question is there any appetite or plans that you can see from your chair of tying up better the stock markets between Canadian companies and the Mexican stock market?
Yep.
I didn't listen. The question is there any plans or do you see some appetite of Canadian companies in getting closer to the Mexican stock market?
Oh, so for Canadian companies to list on the Mexican Stock Exchange, is that your question?
Exactly.
I could see that happening over time. As I mentioned, Magna, Linamar, two auto companies, for example, TransCanada Corp, which is in the pipeline business, ATCO, which is in the pipeline business, have significant operations here. I don't see why over a period of time in terms of broadening their appeal to their shareholder base that they wouldn't list their stock here. I think it would make sense.
So with that, I think our time is up. I want to thank Brian for his open and frank discussion and look forward to working with you as always. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.